Life was good. At least that's what I thought. Camille and I had been married for almost 15 years, and from the outside looking in, we seemed solid. I mean, we had it all: a beautiful home in Ridgeview City, a successful business, and what I believed, a partnership built on love and trust. But it turns out, trust can be fragile when it's misplaced. And love can be weaponized. It started small. Camille began acting off. At first, it was just little things I could have easily brushed off if they hadn't piled up over time. Her phone, for example. She started taking it everywhere. And not in the usual way people do. It was glued to her hand like it held the crown jewels. When I glanced at her screen, she'd tilt it away, saying something about privacy or work emails. It made me uneasy, but I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Camille was always a little private, and who was I to accuse her of something I couldn't prove? Then there were the late nights. She'd say she was working on a new charity event or catching up with an old friend. And hey, Ridgeview had a tight-knit social scene. Everyone knew everyone. It wasn't crazy for her to be out networking. But the stories didn't always line up. One time she said she was at a benefit downtown, but when I casually mentioned it to someone who'd attended, they looked confused, said she wasn't there. I let it slide, convincing myself they'd just missed each other in the crowd. But what got me most was the perfume. Camille had always been into subtle, elegant scents, the kind that lingered just enough to remind you of her presence. This new fragrance was different. Stronger, bolder, unfamiliar. I noticed it on her clothes, her skin, even her car. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying it was a free sample from a friend. It wasn't until I found a receipt from a boutique I'd never heard of that I realized she'd been buying it regularly. And yet, I hesitated. Accusing your wife of cheating isn't something you throw out there lightly, especially when you're not ready to face the answer. So I did what anyone in my position might do. I started paying attention, watching, waiting, hoping I was wrong. But deep down, I think I already knew. The tipping point came one Thursday evening. Camille had told me she'd be at a board meeting for her charity. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it, but something didn't sit right. She'd spent nearly an hour getting ready. Far too much effort for a meeting that was supposed to be with a group of older women planning the next gala. Her dress was sleek, almost daring, not the kind of outfit you'd wear for a casual sit-down with ladies from the neighborhood. As she left, I caught her smiling at her phone, typing quickly before slipping it into her purse. That night, I couldn't stop replaying the little inconsistencies in my head. The missed events, the new perfume, the way she seemed so distant lately. I needed answers, and I couldn't rely on Camille to give them to me. That's when I called Fiona Drake. Fiona came highly recommended, known for her discretion and her ability to dig up the kind of dirt no one else could. I wasn't proud of hiring a private investigator, but what choice did I have? I needed the truth, and Fiona was my way to get it. I just need to know if there's someone else, I told her. And if there is, I need to know who. For the next 2 weeks, Fiona worked quietly, keeping me updated with snippets of information. Camille had been meeting a man, a regular occurrence, apparently. Fiona sent over a photo of the two of them at a downtown restaurant, sitting close, their heads tilted toward each other like they were sharing secrets. He looked familiar, but it took me a moment to place him. Vincent. He was a developer, someone I'd crossed paths with a few times in the business world. Younger than me by maybe a decade, but ambitious and cocky. The kind of guy who thought the rules didn't apply to him. I could almost hear his smarmy laugh in my head. The photos were damning, but Fiona wasn't done. Over the next week, she uncovered phone records, hotel bookings, and even a receipt for an expensive bracelet Camille had apparently gifted him. My wife wasn't just cheating, she was investing in this guy, pouring herself into him the way she used to with me. But the real kicker came when Fiona dug deeper into Vincent. It turned out he wasn't just sleeping with my wife, he was working with her to undermine me. Fiona discovered emails between the two of them. In one, Camille detailed accounts from my company, suggesting ways to shift funds without raising suspicion. They were planning to siphon money from Marston Developments, setting themselves up for a comfortable life while leaving me in the dust. The betrayal burned like acid. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. They weren't content with destroying my marriage. They wanted to take everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built from the ground up. And they thought I wouldn't see it coming. They were wrong. I wasn't the kind of man to roll over and play the victim. If Camille and Vincent wanted a fight, they were about to find out just how far I was willing to go. I spent the next few days in a haze of anger and calculation. Sleep was a distant memory. My mind buzzed with one question. How do I make them pay? Not just for the affair, but for the audacity of their plan to strip me of everything. Fiona had given me everything I needed, every damning detail. I had enough evidence to end the affair, ruin Vincent, and leave Camille in a position where she'd have no choice but to crawl back to me, begging for mercy. But I wasn't interested in mercy. Not anymore. The first step was to keep calm. Acting impulsively would only tip my hand. Camille needed to believe I was still the clueless husband, too busy with work to notice the cracks in our life. So I played my part, cordial but distant, like any husband distracted by deadlines and clients. She barely seemed to notice. She even tried to kiss me one morning before heading out, but I turned my cheek, pretending to sip coffee. Late meeting tonight, she said with a casual smile, grabbing her bag. The same routine, the same lies. Of course, I said, without looking up from the paper. Don't wait up, she added, breezing out the door. Little did she know, I was already 5 steps ahead. That evening, while she was out on her so-called meeting, I started laying the groundwork. My first move was securing Marston Developments. I couldn't let her or Vincent touch my company. With my legal team on speed dial, I initiated a series of asset transfers and safeguards. Properties were shifted to LLCs under different names, accounts were restructured, and I quietly froze the funds Camille had access to. She wouldn't notice right away, her credit cards would work for small purchases, but anything significant would flag. By the time she tried to make a move, the walls would already be closing in. I didn't stop there. Fiona had given me access to Camille's messages and Vincent's emails. I combed through them late into the night, looking for any edge I could use. What I found was even more disgusting than I'd expected. Camille gushing about Vincent, calling him her escape and soulmate. It made my stomach turn, but the emails also showed how clumsy they were. They discussed their plans openly, never imagining someone might be reading over their shoulders. That's when I decided on my next step. Confrontation. The following weekend, I suggested a dinner party, a small gathering at our house. Camille was hesitant, saying she was busy with work, but I insisted. It's been ages since we entertained, I said, feigning enthusiasm. It'll be good for us. She reluctantly agreed. I made sure the guest list was carefully curated, a few mutual friends, key business contacts, and, of course, Vincent. I knew Camille would insist he come, under the guise of networking. She wouldn't pass up the chance to flaunt him in plain sight, believing me too blind to notice. When the night arrived, I played the perfect host, laughing, chatting, making sure everyone's drinks were full. Vincent showed up fashionably late, swaggering in like he owned the place. Camille greeted him a little too warmly, her hand lingering on his arm. I clenched my jaw but smiled, pretending I hadn't noticed. Throughout the evening, I watched them, careful not to give away my thoughts. They were cautious, staying on opposite ends of the room most of the night, but their glances gave them away. And when Camille excused herself to get more wine and Vincent followed a few minutes later, I knew exactly where they were going. Quietly, I slipped away from the group, taking the back staircase to avoid being seen. The guest room upstairs was dark, but I could hear whispers behind the closed door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, heart pounding with rage. But I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I pressed my ear to the door. Camille's voice was soft, conspiratorial. Elliot has no idea, she said, her tone dripping with smugness. Vincent chuckled, low and arrogant. By the time he figures it out, we'll be long gone. I stepped back, fists clenched, but I forced myself to breathe. This wasn't the moment for an outburst. Not yet. Let them think they were still in control. They'd underestimate me again and again, and that would be their downfall. Returning to the party, I made sure to act like nothing was amiss. But inside, I was already planning the next move. Camille and Vincent thought they were playing me. They had no idea the real game was just beginning. After that dinner party, I knew one thing for certain. Camille and Vincent felt invincible. They believed their secret was safe, their plan airtight. But their confidence was their greatest weakness. It made them reckless, predictable, and I was ready to use that against them. The next morning, I called Fiona. "It's time to escalate," I told her. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. Her professionalism was one of the reasons I'd hired her. Over the next week, she helped me gather the last pieces of evidence I needed. I wanted to be thorough, to make sure when I struck, there would be no room for denial or recovery. I started with the bank accounts. Camille had been withdrawing small amounts of cash, likely trying to keep it off the radar. But Fiona uncovered a separate account under her maiden name, one I'd never known about. Deposits from our joint funds had been trickling in for months, and withdrawals matched suspiciously with hotel bookings and luxury purchases. I smiled grimly as Fiona forwarded the records to me. This was exactly the kind of ammo I needed. Next, I focused on Vincent. Through some creative digging, Fiona uncovered a slew of dirty dealings in his business. It turned out his company was barely afloat, kept alive by a series of risky loans and questionable partnerships. His investors were already nervous, and if the wrong information were to leak, it could send his entire house of cards tumbling down. Perfect. The opportunity to set my plan in motion came faster than I expected. Camille approached me one evening, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "Elliot, I've noticed you've been distant," she said, laying a hand on my arm. "Is everything okay?" I almost laughed at the irony. "Just work," I replied smoothly, pretending to be distracted by my laptop. "Things have been hectic." She nodded, giving me a sympathetic smile. I was thinking, maybe we should take a break. A weekend away, just the two of us. My stomach turned at her audacity. A weekend away? While she was plotting with Vincent. But I kept my composure. "That sounds nice," I said. "Let me check my schedule." I knew she didn't mean it. Camille wasn't interested in saving our marriage. This was just another tactic to keep me in the dark. And it was exactly what I needed. Over the next few days, I planted my own breadcrumbs. I left my phone unlocked, with a few cryptic texts from an accountant about potential issues with the company. I casually mentioned a big meeting with my lawyers, making sure she overheard. I wanted her to think I was distracted, preoccupied. I wanted her to feel safe enough to move forward with her plan. Then, the moment came. One evening, Camille left for another meeting, dressed to the nines and humming to herself. As soon as she was gone, I called Fiona. "It's time," I said. Within an hour, everything was in motion. Step 1 was the financial trap. I triggered the safeguards I'd set up weeks ago, freezing every account Camille could access. By the time she tried to withdraw money, she'd be met with an error message and a phone call from the bank's fraud department. Step 2 was the public exposure. I sent the emails and photos Fiona had gathered, carefully edited of course, to a select group of influential people in Ridgeview. These were people who thrived on gossip, who would spread the story far and wide without needing any encouragement. By morning, Camille and Vincent's affair would be the talk of the town. And then there was step 3, the personal blow. I scheduled a meeting with my legal team for the following day. Camille had no idea I'd already filed for divorce, citing infidelity and financial misconduct. By the time she returned home, she'd find the papers waiting for her, along with a list of every asset I'd secured beyond her reach. That night, I poured myself a glass of scotch and sat in the quiet of my study, the weight of the plan settling over me. This wasn't just revenge. It was a reset. A way to take back control, to reclaim my life from the ashes of her betrayal. Camille thought she'd beaten me, that I was too blind to see the truth. But by the time she realized the game had changed, it would already be over. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like peace. It wasn't over yet, but the pieces were falling into place. And tomorrow, I'd deliver the first blow. The next morning, Camille returned home looking smug. She carried herself with a kind of confidence that made my blood boil, like she'd already won some invisible war. Her emerald dress from the night before hung loosely on her frame, a little rumpled but still dazzling. She strolled into the kitchen, where I was nursing a coffee, and dropped her purse on the counter. "Morning," she said casually, as though she hadn't been out all night. I nodded, taking a slow sip. "Morning." Camille busied herself pouring a cup of tea, humming softly to herself. "I thought we could have a quiet day today," she said, leaning against the counter. Just us. Her casual tone was almost laughable. But I played along. Sounds good, I replied, flipping through a folder on the table. Inside were the divorce papers, ready to be handed over. I didn't have to wait long for the moment. As she turned to head upstairs, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, then hesitated when she saw the name on the screen, Vincent. Her fingers twitched as she quickly silenced the call and slid the phone into her pocket. The way her shoulders stiffened told me everything I needed to know. She was nervous. She could feel something was off. Camille, I called, setting down my coffee. We need to talk. She froze for a split second before turning to face me, masking her unease with a practiced smile. What is it? I gestured to the chair across from me. Sit. Her smile faltered, but she did as I asked, her tea untouched in front of her. You're being very serious this morning, she said, her tone light but probing. I placed the folder on the table between us. I know. She glanced at it, then back at me, her brow furrowing. What's this? Open it. For a moment, she didn't move, her fingers twitching slightly. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached for the folder and flipped it open. Her eyes scanned the top page, the color draining from her face as the words "petition for divorce" stared back at her. What is this?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said, my tone calm but firm. "We're done, Camille. You've made sure of that?" Her eyes flicked up to mine, wide with shock. "Elliot, wait, this is—" "Don't bother denying it," I cut in, leaning back in my chair. "I know everything, Camille. The affair. The secret bank account. The plan to bleed my company dry. I know it all." Her mouth opened, then closed, words failing her. She looked cornered, like a deer caught in headlights. "It's not what you think," she finally said, her voice shaking. "I can explain." I laughed, sharp and humorless. "Explain? Please, I'd love to hear this one." Camille's face flushed as she scrambled for an excuse. It was a mistake," she stammered. "A moment of weakness." "A moment?" I interrupted, my voice rising slightly. "Spare me. This wasn't a one-time thing, Camille. You didn't trip and fall into a months-long affair. And you sure as hell didn't accidentally conspire to steal from me." She flinched at my words, tears pooling in her eyes. But I wasn't buying the act. I'd seen her crocodile tears before, her ability to cry on command when it suited her. This wasn't regret. It was panic. "You don't understand," she pleaded. "I was—" "Stop," I said firmly, holding up a hand. "Don't insult me by pretending you're the victim here. You made your choices, and now you'll live with the consequences." Her face crumpled as she stared at the papers in front of her. "Elliot, please," she whispered. "We can fix this." I stood, pushing back my chair. "There's nothing to fix," I said coldly. "Your access to our accounts has been revoked. Every asset is protected. And as for Vincent," I smirked, leaning closer. "He's about to find out just how bad it is to cross me." Camille's tears spilled over, but I felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy. She'd built this house of lies, and now it was collapsing around her. "Elliot," she choked out, reaching for my arm. "Please." I stepped back, shaking my head. "Don't. Just don't." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her sitting there, broken and defeated. It was the first blow, but it wouldn't be the last. With Camille reeling from the divorce papers and her access to my life cut off, it was time to deal with Vincent. He'd slithered into my world, thinking he could take what was mine and walk away unscathed. He didn't realize who he was dealing with. The morning after my confrontation with Camille, I sent Fiona a quick message. Activate Plan B. She didn't need more details. In the weeks leading up to this, we'd pieced together enough dirt on Vincent to bury him professionally, socially, and financially. Step 1 was subtle but devastating. I leaked a few critical pieces of information about his business. Through anonymous tips, whispers began spreading among Ridgeview's investor circles. Word got out that Vincent's company was bleeding money, his projects riddled with delays and hidden costs. Investors hate uncertainty, and within days, several of his backers pulled out. It didn't stop there. Fiona had uncovered a fraudulent loan Vincent had taken out using fake documents to secure funding for one of his developments. I made sure those documents landed in the right hands, an overzealous bank auditor who had no problem escalating things to law enforcement. By the end of the week, Vincent's office had been raided, his accounts frozen pending investigation. But financial ruin wasn't enough. Vincent had built a reputation as a charmer, someone who could woo investors and society alike with his slick talk and polished image. It was time to rip that mask off. I called in a favor from a journalist I knew, someone who owed me for a tip I'd given them years ago. I handed over a dossier on Vincent, a mix of his shady dealings, his affair with Camille, and, most damning, a recording Fiona had obtained. It was a conversation between Vincent and Camille, detailing their plan to take down my company and mocking my supposed ignorance. By the time he figures it out, Vincent's smug voice said in the recording, "We'll be untouchable." The guy thinks he's untouchable, but really, he's just too blind to see what's happening right under his nose. The journalist didn't hesitate. The article went live 2 days later, accompanied by the audio clip and damning photos of Vincent and Camille cozying up in hotels and restaurants. The headline was brutal: Ridgeview's golden developer. Fraud, infidelity, and a broken empire. The fallout was immediate. Vincent's remaining investors severed ties, his face plastered across every local news outlet. Social media exploded, turning him into a pariah almost overnight. Clients dropped his projects, lawsuits started piling up, and people who once fawned over him now crossed the street to avoid being associated with his name. The final blow came in person. I knew where Vincent would be. Desperation has a way of making people predictable. He'd retreated to his favorite bar downtown, drowning his sorrows in expensive whiskey he could no longer afford. When I walked in, the place went silent. Vincent looked up from his drink, his face pale, eyes bloodshot. "You," he spat, his voice slurred with alcohol. "Me," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. He tried to sit up straighter, as if he still had some power left. "You think you've won," he sneered. "This isn't over." I leaned in, my voice calm but laced with steel. "It is over, Vincent. You just haven't realized it yet." His jaw tightened, and he looked away, downing the rest of his drink. "You're a fool," he muttered. "You don't understand how these things work. People like me end up exactly where you are." I cut him off, gesturing to the bartender for another drink. "You thought you could take what's mine and walk away? Did you really think I wouldn't fight back?" Vincent glared at me, but there was no fight left in his eyes. "You don't scare me," he said, though his trembling hands said otherwise. I smirked, leaning back in my chair. "You should be scared. You've lost your investors, your company, your reputation. And Camille." I chuckled. "She's not exactly the loyal type, is she?" He flinched at that, his bravado crumbling. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing," I said, standing up. "I already have everything I need." As I walked out, I didn't bother looking back. Vincent's world was in ruins, and I had no doubt he'd spend the rest of his life haunted by the choices that led him there. One down, one to go. With Vincent out of the picture, Camille had nowhere to turn. She stayed in the house for a few days after I served her the divorce papers, acting like she could still salvage things. She'd alternate between apologizing and accusing me of overreacting, as if her betrayal wasn't the root of all of this. "Elliot, we can work through this," she pleaded one morning, her voice cracking. "Think about everything we've built together. You can't just throw it away." I stared at her, my expression flat. "Everything we built? Camille, you threw it away the moment you brought Vincent into our lives." Her eyes brimmed with tears, but I wasn't moved. "I made a mistake," she whispered. "I was stupid. I didn't think it would go this far." I leaned forward, my voice cold. "You didn't think about anything except yourself. You weren't just unfaithful. You tried to destroy me, my business, my life. This isn't something you come back from." Camille sank into the chair across from me, her face pale. For the first time, she seemed to realize how dire her situation was. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You're just done with me?" "Yes," I said simply. "I am." The next day, I made it clear that her time in the house was up. "You need to leave, Camille," I told her, crossing my arms as she stood in the foyer. You've got 2 days to figure out where you're going. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. Leave? Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem, I said. You can stay with Vincent. Oh wait, no you can't. He's probably too busy scrambling to save himself. She glared at me, anger flaring in her eyes. You're cruel, she spat. I made a mistake, but I didn't deserve this. I tilted my head, giving her a humorless smile. Didn't you? You plotted to ruin me, Camille. Don't act like the victim now. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but then her shoulders slumped. She stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. Camille's departure was anything but graceful. 2 days later, she loaded her designer luggage into the trunk of her car, her movements stiff with anger and humiliation. A small crowd of neighbors gathered to watch, whispering among themselves as she fumbled with her bags. She shot me a glare as I stood on the porch, arms crossed. You're going to regret this, Elliot, she hissed. Mark my words. I chuckled, shaking my head. The only thing I regret is trusting you in the first place. She climbed into the car and peeled out of the driveway, tires screeching. The neighbors pretended to look away, but I saw their smirks. Camille always prided herself on her image, and now it was in shambles. For the next week, I heard little from her, but I knew she was spiraling. Fiona kept tabs on her, feeding me updates as Camille struggled to find her footing. She tried to stay with a friend, but the gossip had spread too far. People didn't want to be associated with her. Eventually, Camille moved in with her mother, a woman she'd always looked down on for living a modest life. Fiona even caught wind of an argument between the two, with Camille shouting, "You don't understand what I'm going through." Her mother's reply? "I understand that you ruined your marriage and your reputation for a man who abandoned you." It was poetic justice. One evening Camille called me, her voice thick with desperation. "Elliot, please. I can't do this. I can't start over like this. Can we just talk?" I let the silence stretch, my grip tightening on the phone. Finally I said, "No, Camille. There's nothing left to talk about." She started to sob, but I hung up before I could hear more. Camille had made her choices. Now, she was finally facing the consequences. With Camille out of the house and Vincent's life in ruins, you'd think I'd feel victorious, like I'd finally regained control. But the truth? I wasn't done yet. I didn't just want them to suffer. I wanted them to understand. To feel the betrayal, the uncertainty, the paranoia they tried to inflict on me. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about making them realize that every choice has consequences. Camille was the easier target. Fiona helped me set up a burner number and craft the messages, vague enough to keep her guessing but specific enough to send her spiraling. The first text came 2 days after she moved in with her mother. "We know everything. The truth always comes out." Her reply came almost instantly. "Who is this? What do you mean?" I didn't answer. The silence was deliberate, planting seeds of doubt. A few days later, I sent another. "Vincent won't protect you. He's only looking out for himself." That one must have struck a nerve. According to Fiona, Camille confronted Vincent, accusing him of withholding information and blaming him for everything falling apart. Their shouting match spilled into the parking lot of some rundown motel where Vincent was staying. They were turning on each other, exactly as I'd hoped. Vincent wasn't spared either. His messages were crafted to exploit his ego, his need to feel in control. The first was simple. "Your investors are asking questions. Better have answers." Fiona had timed it perfectly, sending it just as Vincent's phone buzzed with a real inquiry from a former backer. He must have thought the message was related, because he started replying frantically. "Who is this? What do you want?" I waited a day before sending another. "Check the news tomorrow. Things are about to get worse." The following morning, another article dropped. This one wasn't about Vincent's business, it was about his personal life. Fiona had fed the journalist new photos of Vincent with Camille, along with rumors that they'd siphoned money from Marston Developments. The piece stopped just short of accusing them outright but left enough breadcrumbs for readers to draw their own conclusions. Vincent's name became synonymous with fraud and scandal. His phone calls went unanswered, his emails ignored. Even his so-called friends stopped returning his texts. But the real fun came with the surveillance footage. Fiona had planted cameras in places Vincent and Camille frequented, capturing their tense interactions. One night, I sent Camille a video of Vincent meeting with another woman at a bar. The angle made it seem intimate, even though Fiona assured me it was just a casual conversation. Camille's reaction was immediate. She called Vincent, screaming about his betrayal, accusing him of moving on without her. He, of course, denied everything, but the damage was done. For Vincent, I sent forged documents suggesting Camille had been quietly funneling money into her own account, preparing to cut ties with him. His paranoia kicked in, and he confronted her, accusing her of setting him up to take the fall. Their fragile alliance crumbled under the weight of their mistrust. Meanwhile, I stayed in the shadows, watching as they unraveled. Fiona kept me updated, her reports painting a picture of two people caught in a web of lies they couldn't escape. Camille started losing weight, her once perfect appearance now gaunt and disheveled. Vincent was spotted pacing outside his motel late at night, his hair unkempt, his phone clutched tightly in his hand as he shouted at someone unseen. I could have stopped there. But I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. They thought they'd destroyed me. It was only fair I returned the favor. By now, Camille and Vincent were barely hanging on. Their betrayal had cost them their reputations, their finances, and their peace of mind. But there was one thing left to take: their pride. Public humiliation was never my style before this. I was the kind of man who preferred to handle problems quietly, behind closed doors. But after what they'd done, I realized some lessons needed an audience. The opportunity came in the form of our old estate. Camille had begged to keep it during the divorce proceedings, but the house was firmly in my name. Once the dust settled, I put it on the market, not because I needed the money, but because I wanted it to be a spectacle. The estate was a jewel of Ridgeview, sprawling gardens and high ceilings that everyone admired. It was the kind of place people whispered about, fantasized about owning. So when I announced a public auction for the property, it immediately became the talk of the town. I made sure Camille got an invitation. The day of the auction was sunny, almost mocking in its brightness. I stood at a discreet distance as bidders gathered on the front lawn, sipping champagne and making small talk. The air buzzed with excitement, but my focus was elsewhere. Camille arrived late, her mother trailing behind her. She looked rattled, her clothes mismatched, her hair barely brushed. She paused at the gate, taking in the crowd and the auction sign hanging over the door she once called her own. I watched as she clenched her jaw, squaring her shoulders before stepping onto the lawn. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for me, but I made sure to stay out of sight. Instead, I watched as she approached the auctioneer, her voice sharp as she demanded an explanation. "This is my home," she snapped. The auctioneer barely looked at her. "Not anymore, ma'am," he replied, motioning for the event to begin. Her mother tried to pull her back, whispering something in her ear, but Camille shoved her off, storming toward the front steps. "You can't do this, Elliot," she shouted, turning in circles as if I might materialize from the crowd. "You have no right." Her voice cracked, and people began whispering. Some laughed quietly, others looked away, embarrassed for her. That's when I stepped forward. "I have every right, Camille," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to carry. The crowd turned to me, their murmurs growing louder. Camille froze, her face pale as she locked eyes with me. "This isn't just about the house," I continued, taking a slow step closer. "It's about choices. Actions have consequences. And today, you're facing yours." Her lips trembled, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stood there, motionless, as the auctioneer began the bidding. I didn't stay for the whole event. Watching her crumble on that lawn, surrounded by the life she'd destroyed, was enough. But it didn't end there. The proceeds from the auction? I donated every penny to the local women's shelter, the same one Camille had once dismissed as a waste of resources. The press ate it up, the story of a betrayed husband turning tragedy into charity. Camille, of course, heard about it. She tried to paint it as a petty move, calling me vindictive and cruel. But her words fell on deaf ears. By now, no one cared what Camille Marston had to say. Vincent wasn't spared from the humiliation either. Using shadow companies, I quietly bought out every competitor he tried to work for, leaving him blacklisted in the industry. Eventually, word got out that he'd taken a job in manual labor, a far cry from the sleek office he once flaunted. One day, I drove by his construction site, just to see it for myself. There he was, wearing a hard hat and covered in dirt, his once pristine confidence now replaced with exhaustion. I didn't stop the car or roll down the window. I didn't need to. Just seeing him there, struggling to rebuild a life he'd shattered with his greed, was enough. Camille and Vincent had spent months trying to destroy me, and now, their lives were unrecognizable. As I drove away from the site, a strange sense of peace settled over me. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The humiliation was complete, and justice had been served. The storm had finally passed. Camille and Vincent's worlds were in ruins, their schemes and betrayal reduced to nothing but whispers in Ridgeview's gossip circles. For me, the victory wasn't just in the destruction. It was in reclaiming my life, piece by piece, and finding something solid to stand on again. I sold the company shortly after the auction, a decision I'd been mulling over for years. It wasn't out of necessity. Marston Developments was thriving, protected from the chaos Camille and Vincent had tried to unleash. But after everything, I realized I wanted more than boardrooms and contracts. I wanted a life that wasn't defined by work, betrayal, or vengeance. The sale brought me an obscene amount of money, enough to start fresh anywhere in the world. And that's exactly what I did. I found myself in a quiet coastal town far from Ridgeview, where the air smelled of salt and the waves drowned out the noise of the past. I bought a modest villa perched on a cliff, its large windows overlooking the endless ocean. It was peaceful, unpretentious, exactly what I needed. Most days, I kept to myself, savoring the simplicity of this new chapter. I'd wake early, take long walks along the beach, and spend afternoons reading or tinkering with a small sailboat I'd impulsively bought. The locals were friendly but not intrusive. They didn't ask questions about who I was or why I'd come here. To them, I was just Elliot, the quiet guy with the sharp suits who showed up at the diner on Fridays for fish and chips. It was perfect. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers about Camille or Vincent. Fiona stayed in touch, updating me when she thought it was relevant. Camille, it seemed, had moved in with an old friend from college, working part-time as a retail clerk to get by. Her once glamorous social media accounts were gone, replaced by the occasional blurry photo of her mother's backyard. Vincent, he hadn't fared much better. Rumor had it he'd tried to leave Ridgeview for a fresh start, but his reputation followed him. Last I heard, he was living paycheck to paycheck, his arrogance reduced to bitter resentment. They were shadows of the people they once were, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger toward them. Just indifference. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the ocean, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the patio, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. For the first time in months, I let myself truly reflect, not on the pain or the betrayal, but on the strength it had taken to rise above it. Camille and Vincent had tried to destroy me, but they'd only taught me how to rebuild. I wasn't the same man I'd been before, but maybe that was the point. The future stretched out before me, wide and open like the horizon. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself a small, genuine smile. The past was behind me, the scars were healing, and the person I'd become was stronger than ever. In the distance, the waves kept rolling in, steady and endless. Life went on, and so would I.